السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. أهلا بكم إلى هذه الحلقة من برنامج من الداخل عبر قناة الميادين. معكم زينب الصفار. لعل ما يسمى بقوانين معاداة السامية التي تم اختبارها في أستراليا تهدف إلى حماية صورة الكيان الإسرائيلي والرقابة والسيطرة على أي نقاش سياسي في البلاد كما يرى البعض. بالتالي أي انتقادات لإسرائيل هل تجد طريقها بلا هوادة إلى أن تصنف على أنها عنصرية أو معادية للسامية، ما لم ينتبه أولئك الذين يختلفون مع إسرائيل على كل كلمة ينطقون ويتفوهون بها. هل هذه هي اللعبة الحقيقية هنا؟ إسكات وقمع أي معارضة ضد إسرائيل، حكاية ترهيب حقيقي، ملاحقة ومحاكمة وحملات تشويه وسجن وإبعاد وأثمان باهظة تدفع للدفاع عن حرية التعبير والحفاظ عليها وأكثر. بريندون لي أوكونيل السجين السياسي الأسترالي يحدثنا عن تجربته الحية في هذا السياق والخلفية والأسباب الحقيقية التي أدت إلى اعتقاله ومحاكمته كأول مواطن يسجن ويحاكم بموجب قوانين التشهير العنصري في أستراليا الغربية. لكن لماذا هو؟ وما الرسائل التي يعتزم إرسالها إلى مواطني أستراليا عبر اعتقال وسجن وملاحقة بريندون أوكونيل؟ لكشف خلفية هذه القضية من الداخل يطيب لنا أن نستقبل من العاصمة الماليزية كوالالمبور بريندون أوكونيل, Australian writer and former political prisoner, joining us today from Kuala Lumpur, Central City, Malaysia. Welcome to Min al-Dakhil from the inside, Brandon.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Pure pleasure to have you. Well, Brandon, now you're living in exile, in fear for your life, because you claim to be targeted by Zionist groups tied directly to extreme right-wing Israeli politicians for supporting and attending a Friends of Palestine group in Perth, Western Australia. Tell us more about your curious case as the first person to be jailed and tried under the Western Australia's racial vilification laws. Is it solely based on your support of Palestine and the Palestinian rights as a member of the FOP? And how has all this started? The circumstances of your trial, your sentence, and your deprivation while in jail from your rights.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's a pretty big story, and it started way back in 2009 after Operation Cast Lead. I was not a member of the Friends of Palestine, but I attended a rally and had met the head of the organisation, Alex Wisson, earlier. And I was just doing some filming and making a video. I don't belong to any groups. I'm a former registered nurse, ICU and emergency department trained. And I just went down there. I'm not any particular political persuasion. I just met a lot of people. I had Arab friends, I had Muslim friends and Palestinian Christian friend, and I'd learnt over time what was going on. And as I learnt more, I felt I couldn't remain quiet. And I just went to express my support. And we were stalked by two members of radical Jewish groups out of Western Australia, Mr. Stanley Elliott Keyser, who's the president of the Australasian Union of Jewish Students, and also a member of Habanim Dror. These are radical Zionist groups, and also a quote, this is his own words, a big fan of our friends, our beloved friends, Chabad Lubavitch. And an altercation ensued. It was a perfectly legitimate political discussion. And the words I used were, as he stalked us and filmed us, you are a racist Jew with a religion of racism, hate, homicide, and ethnic cleansing. Those are my basic words. And I also then discussed specific issues. And for that alone, I got 3 years jail in total. But for that simple political altercation, I received 1 year's jail.
Brandon, before we talk about your sentence, allow me to ask you about, it is your political views that have caused you to be behind bars. Now tell us, what are these WA laws, and why is WA the only state in Australia to have this type of legislation?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I didn't find out till many years later the very close relationship that Israel has with Western Australia, and in particular Benjamin Netanyahu himself is close personal friends with the former Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, who comes from Perth, Western Australia, my hometown. I met her once. She's actually quite polite, a very nice lady, and also the largest media mogul, the Seven Network in Australia, Kerry Stokes, a very well-known Western Australia, is also very close with Benjamin Netanyahu and Henry Kissinger, and of course James Packer from Crown Casino, who is on bribery charges with Benjamin Netanyahu. So I had walked into a hornet's nest completely unknown to myself just by linking the racist apartheid state of Israel and its behaviour with, of course, Israeli high technology issues that I write about. And when I linked them together, basically all hell broke loose.
We will talk about these technical issues in detail, Brandon, but let's go back to your sentence. You were convicted under the 2010 controversial, in 2010 actually, controversial anti-discrimination laws after posting a series of YouTube videos depicting Israel as a, quote, racist, homicidal regime. So, Brandon, is it now racist to call someone a racist?
Apparently so, and I give credit to the very conservative opinion piece writer Paul Murray, who actually defended me. I couldn't believe it after I was jailed, and he asked that exact question. Is it now racist to call someone a racist? Or is it only racist to call the Jew a racist? This was a political speech. It was purely political. He approached us. He had harassed us. And it was, quite frankly, outrageous. Now, of course, I realise now that the law is, there's ways to play the law, and I'm not very good at playing games. But there seemed to be a policy of just be quiet and just go away, basically. They just didn't want it talked about at all.
Maybe, Brandon, you should have put, or you should have drawn a line of distinction between Judaism or being Jewish as a religion and being Zionist.
Well, I did draw a line, but I think that's a very hard line to draw when you have the very foundation of Zionism is the return to the land of our fathers, which is in the Jewish holy books. And of course, you have the racist, homicidal lunacy of many of the Orthodox Judaism, and in particular the Siddim, the ultra-Orthodox, like Chabad Lubavitch, the Babylonian Talmud, the Shulchan Aruch. These books are racist hate literature, and even in Russia, 5,000.
Of course, I agree with you that any sort of extremism, be it in Islam, in Christianity, or in Judaism, it's all something that we do not agree with, and it should be noted. But after you released, Brandon, you have continued with your activism and was charged again, but attempted to flee Australia. Today you are, you're abroad. How is Israel today subverting parliamentary democracy and instigating a new set of values contrary to the Australian Constitution and which threatens directly freedom of speech?
Yeah, well, the political Zionist movement is simply so powerful and so subversive. And as we saw with the likes of a Jeffrey Epstein, Israel seems to have a political blackmail and sexual blackmail operation going full time. I think some of it is partly through ignorance. I had actually met some very good police, ex-military, even the lawyers and some judges I had met and given material, and they thanked me and shook my hand. Unfortunately, it was clear political interference, which gives you an understanding of the terror that this man called Benjamin Netanyahu seems to have. He just seems to I can only call him a thug, a gangster. And places like Chabad Lubavitch are political groups posing as religious groups seem to have everyone in their pocket. Josh Frydenberg is a member of parliament, and he's hanging around and very close friends with these groups. How is this possible? They're worse than neo-Nazis, and I don't understand it. It seems to be a lot of grounding in ignorance. And that once people do understand and once they get some information, the case actually, I got a lot of information to lawyers and even a judge, and you could see it. It had a huge influence on them. They simply didn't know.
It seems that those anti-discrimination laws, vilification laws are just, they are on the table when it comes to specific people, but a specific sort of people, or specific race of people. But when it comes to Islamophobia or whatever, they are just sidelined.
I could tell you stories you wouldn't believe what's going on, in particular in Western Australia, but also Sydney. It's a daily occurrence where women are having their hijabs ripped off. I've been on buses in Perth, Western Australia, where young thugs are screaming at young mothers, young Muslim mothers in hijabs, calling them terrorists. I've seen this with my own eyes. This is the media beat up who is responsible for this, but there's no comeback. They're told, sorry, there's no religious vilification. However, in the legislation, there is national origins. So when they start screaming, go back where you came from, the legislation could be enacted. The police simply refuse to do so. The police prosecutors refuse to do so.
Right.
And I think it's largely ignorance with the legislation itself, because I met some very nice police officers, but I also met some very dumb ones.
Right. Allow us, Brandon, to stop now for a short break. We will continue to talk further about your curious case, but we have to stop for this short break. إذا فاصل قصير ونعود. لا تذهبوا بعيدا. هل سيؤدي أي انتقاد لإسرائيل في النهاية إلى اعتبار مطلقه متعصباً ومعادياً للسامية، إلا إذا تنبه كل شخص لا يتوافق معها على كل كلمة يقولونها؟ هل هذه هي اللعبة الفعلية هنا، أي إسكات كل شخص يتكلم ضد إسرائيل؟ تساؤلات يطرحها الكاتب الأسترالي بول ميراي. الأسترالي بريندون أوكونيل السجين السياسي السابق يتحدث عن الثمن الباهظ للدفاع عن حرية التعبير.
Yes, and those are the words used by Paul Murray, the opinion piece writer. Look, that's basically what it is. There are very easy ways to bypass the legislation. One is to remain cool and calm. Unfortunately, 10 years ago, I confess to when confronted, I get very confrontational, and this is the problem. But if you can remain cool and calm, then it is very easy to have a rational debate. But the trouble is, the system appears set to try and provoke you. And I notice many of the Jewish extremists and Jewish activists will go out of their way to provoke you to enact legislation. But if you can keep a cool head, you can have a debate and you can win. However, without doubt, it is about quashing legitimate criticism of Israel. And it's very difficult for ordinary people to keep a cool head when you're seeing such extremist behaviour from the top levels of polite society within Israel itself. These are mainstream politicians and mainstream rabbis, and they're behaving like gangster thugs, and ordinary people naturally get angry.
Now, that said, do you believe that whatever is being targeted or whatever has happened with you and still taking place was a kind of sending a clear message to the people who might share your views to watch out, otherwise they will face a similar fate?
That's exactly what it was all about. In fact, the judge made similar statements. He said, I had an irrational hatred of Jewish people. The trial was a farce. I couldn't present any evidence. And lawyers were intimidated by the arrival of the Israeli ambassador and Israeli deputy foreign minister. It was a clear warning. Didn't work for me personally, just made me more determined, but it was absolutely a way of very publicly flogging me, or in fact nailing me to a cross as a warning to others without question. Without question.
Yes, it made you more determined, but unfortunately you had to change where you have lived all your life. You have to get away from Australia and try to find somewhere else to live, to be away from being tracked by them.
Well, unfortunately, along the way, whilst in prison, I exposed massive corruption. I was beaten half to death. I made many more enemies, unfortunately. But the bottom line was they made it known. They repeatedly raided me 3 more times. And they repeatedly, as I got the legal documentation, as I refused to get a lawyer so I could get the legal brief from police, they were throwing charge after charge after charge at me. I offended Mr. Stephen Lieblich by calling him a case officer for Israeli intelligence, and you can see it in my paperwork where he actually says I was offended because he called me an Israeli spy. And the police raided my house over that. Absolutely unheard of. And because Western Australia is so isolated, and there's special forces based there, the SAS, and they hide protected witnesses down there. It's a very, very unique place, Perth, Western Australia. And that close relationship with Israel really, I wasn't aware of, but I'm aware now, and that explained the particularly vicious nature of the response to myself.
Now, allow me to ask you, Brandon, something very important and technical here. I would like you to tell us about how Israel rules everything and dominates cybersecurity and the high technology sector via something called the TALPIO program. What is this program and how dangerous is it?
Well, a lot of people have now heard about Unit 8200, which is the Israeli equivalent of the NSA, military intelligence based. I first heard of the TALPIO program via a forum post back in 2008, and I started to look it up, and I realized that there wasn't a lot of literature on it, but they were training up individuals for up to 10 years in double majors in science, computer science, etc., and putting them through special forces training. And I thought, how interesting. And then they were making them corporate leaders, CEOs. And if you look at any of the large Israeli companies, and there's many of them, they've all gone through this program to a T. So this is Israeli military intelligence training CEOs. This is vital to understand. And one man in particular, although he didn't go through the program, he was one of the founders, and that is Zohar Zisapel. And who's heard of him? RAD Group, RAD. And yet RAD Group is one of their biggest companies with up to 20 sub-companies, which is handling European and American telecommunications, critical infrastructure security, electrical grids, government VoIP encryption, radar systems, military encryption communications. People think, well, they must be American, of course. No, they're not American. They're Israeli. And then, of course, you have the Intel factory, the most advanced Intel CPU design and fabrication, not just fabrication, design in Israel. And most people still to this day have no idea that Israel is basically a cyber technology juggernaut. And Benjamin Netanyahu brags, we're only a little bit smaller than the United States. And he brags, we are the second eye of the Five Eyes network. This is incredible. And that's their power. So when you hear America, think Israel.
Brandon, here, allow us, Israel has backdoor on all Microsoft devices. What can you tell us about the giant national security threat Israel poses to the United States of America?
Well, now I remember when Obama was in power and Benjamin Netanyahu hated him so much, he simply flew in, spoke to the Congress and flew out and ignored him. Didn't even visit the president. This is unheard of. And you think, how does this arrogant man get away with everything? The control of technology. They backdoored the Intel CPUs, and in fact, the Intel CPUs have been ruined by Israel. Intel is in major decline right now because of Israel. There's no security in their CPUs. AMD is taking over now in Taiwan Semiconductor. And we also have, of course, Microsoft. Who knew that Americans have become so stupid they can't even service their own operating system? They've now sent the Windows Security Center, the very heart of the operating system. This is the keys to the entire operating system, is not coded in Seattle, Washington in the United States. It's coded in Israel by Israeli military intelligence people. This is full access to the core kernel of the operating system and full access to the Azure Microsoft cloud, which includes the Pentagon cloud. This is incredible. And what's more incredible, and I thank you so much for raising this issue, to get it into the Arabic-speaking world, this is why Israel is so powerful.
Right. Allow me here to ask you also, would you explain, please, Israel's use of the Sayanim, or helper, who are prepared to assist Israeli intelligence in all sorts of ways that includes access to databases that they don't already have access to?
Well, this is correct. Not only do they have electronics access much of the time, but if they don't have full electronic access via the SAMM network, and we owe a big debt to Viktor Ostrowski, a former former Mossad case officer, a Canadian citizen, a dual national Canadian Israeli, who wrote about this in his book, The Unmasking of a Mossad Officer. And he wrote the SAMM network utilizing Jews in the diaspora, but also, of course, dual nationals who are going to Israel, serving in the Israeli Defense Force, going through Unit 8200, Telpiot program, and of course Israeli citizens themselves, many of whom are from Russia and the Ukraine. They are then moving out physically into Europe, into the United States, and they are taking up positions, high positions, powerful positions within huge American companies. So even if you ostensibly don't have an Israeli company, you have Israeli dual nationals operating the system itself within the system, and this is this SAMM network. Now, this is a massive national security issue. Massive.
Allow me to ask you one last question in a minute, please. You have a view when it comes to who or what brought down the Ukrainian airliner in Iran last January. What can you tell us about that, please?
Well, I can only speculate like anyone else from a distance.
I would like to listen to your speculation.
Well, I spent 3 months in Iran, and I saw some things which told me that perhaps the Iranians weren't quite as sophisticated as they thought in electronics. But you simply cannot trust Russia, seeing as Benjamin Netanyahu and Vladimir Putin are extremely close. They're using, of course, Russian systems, and Israel's notorious use of malware, such as the Stuxnet virus, they can implant with hardware backdoors with just a few transistors into the chips that are controlling the launch codes, in particular the launch codes. And it would be very easy. We know how cunning Israel can be. And in combination with Russia and the many Israeli Russian citizens that are going back and forth from Russia, it makes perfect sense that it would be child's play for them to backdoor the missile systems. And it would have been very easy, just as some speculate Israel did on 9/11 by altering radar images in the United States via the companies that were handling the radars. It's obvious that it would be very easy.
Right.
Very easy to affect the missile systems within Iran.
Those who make it, those who can break it. Well, Brandon O'Connell, Australian writer and former political prisoner, thank you for joining us from Kuala Lumpur, Central City, Malaysia.
Shukran. Thank you so much for having me.